Allow me to set the stage for one of the greatest feats of personal bravery you will ever hear. Richard the Lionheart swept across the Palestinian coastline in a 2 year campaign that bore witness to the heights of chivalric virtue and the depths of animalistic atrocity. With the conclusion of the Third Crusade, Richard would return to Europe, leaving Palestine partitioned between Christian and Muslim power. And the death of his great rival, Saladin, just a year later would spur the newly seated Pope Innocent II into action. Yearning for the true religion to finally claim the holy city of Jerusalem, Innocent would call upon nobles and peasants alike for yet another crusade. This call, however, yielded disappointing responses. Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II was only 4 years of age, and Richard had local matters to attend to. With the zeal of northern European monarchs spent, the Holy Father looked to his Italian neighbor Venice. The Venetians dominated Mediterranean trade, and having at their disposal the greatest navy of the age, were prime candidates to fulfill Innocent's conquering ambitions. After much haggling, the Venetians agreed to a sum of 85,000 marks to fund the transportation of 4,500 mounted knights, 9,000 squires, 20,000 infantrymen, and enough supplies to sustain the massive army for 9 months. Unlike their kings, many noblemen answered the call, including Count Baldwin of Flanders, with whom the hero of our story accompanied. Each crusader was instructed to bring funds proportionate to his means in order to fund the crusade. However, when it was all counted, the army was short 34,000 marks of the agreed upon 85,000. In order to resolve this delinquency, the Venetians proposed to conquer the Hungarian-held port of Zara that lay across the Adriatic. The most peaceful Pope Innocent III denounced such a plan and declared excommunication to any man that took part in the siege. However, the prospect of vast hoards of gold pulled the army into the Venetian scheme, and they conquered the city in short order, cementing the Venetian takeover of the Fourth Crusade. The Crusaders sent a delegation to Rome, pleading for the army to be absolved of this transgression, which the Pope granted, but he also commanded the army to return any loot they liberated from Zara. However, they did no such thing. Now that the Adriatic was firmly in Venetian control, the fleet set sail for its second objective, the great city of Constantinople. Once again the Holy Father threatened excommunication for any man that took part in the siege, and this time many heeded his words and washed their hands of the crusade altogether. However, for the majority of the Crusaders, sacking the wealthiest city in Europe was far too great a temptation, and the fleet of 480 ships pressed on. On 24th of June, 1203, they reached Constantinople, and the army made of men from rural Western Europe gazed upon her grandeur with wide eyes and slackened jaws. The vastness of the city and her defenses began to sow doubt in the Franks. On this wrote Geoffrey of Villehardouin, that those who had never seen Constantinople opened wide eyes now, for they could not believe that so rich a city could be in the whole world. When they saw her lofty walls and her stately towers wherewith she was encompassed, and these stately palaces and lofty churches, so many in number as no man might believe who had not seen them, and the length and breadth of this town which was sovereign over all others, and know that there was no man among us so bold that his flesh crept at the sight, and therein was no marvel, for never did any men undertake so great a business as this assault of ours since the beginning of the world. Once ashore, a Greek army sallied from the gates of the city to meet her Frankish invaders in battle. The battle-hardened nobility of Western Europe proved too great a foe for Greek levies to face in the open field of battle, and the Byzantine emperor fled to Thrace. The previous emperor and his son were restored to the throne, and for almost a year the Franks involved themselves in the internal politics of the city. The inhabitants' frustration with the horde of who they saw as barbarians escalated into outrage when they discovered the vast sums of money the now emperors had paid the Franks to reinstall them on the throne. The emperors were deposed and the Franks were expelled from the city to where they had been encamped across the straits. Assault plans were made, and the army was now dead set on sacking Constantinople. An amphibious assault on the walls was required from where the Franks were encamped. Therefore, the Venetians built up large siege towers on the prows of their ships, intent on pulling right up against the walls and sending the men up the towers. However, the Greeks also built up their stone towers further with wooden additions, many towers now reaching up to 7 stories high. The first assault was an utter failure. The Franks were beaten back by the wind and the waves, as much as they were by Greek stones and fire. The crusading zeal momentarily left the army, for how could such a holy assault fail if not willed by God himself? The crusading clergy quickly set about righting the resolve of the pilgrim invaders. In a stirring sermon, the bishops present proclaimed that this expedition was of a most holy and righteous nature. All the crusaders needed to do was to make right confessions and partake in Holy Communion, and God would will them over the walls in the next crusade. Thus they set out with clear hearts and grim resolve. The renewed assault started off with similar results to the previous attempt, but with their faith set firmly in God, the pilgrims refused to relent. Their piety was soon rewarded with a change in the sea, and now the waves began pushing the ship's towers against the walls and towers of the defenders. Christians of unfathomable courage began to dive through the windows of the Greek towers every time the waves crashed their ships against the walls. The first foothold was chronicled by a present knight, Robert de Cleric, thus: "So they kept up the attack, until by a miracle of God the ship of the Bishop of Soissons struck against one of the towers, as the sea, which is never still there, carried it forward. Now on the bridge of this ship there was a Venetian and 2 armed knights, and as the ship struck against this tower, the Venetians took hold of it with hands and feet the best he could, and got himself inside. When he was inside, the sergeants, who were in this story, the English, Danes, and Greeks there, looked around and saw him. They rushed on him with axes and swords and cut him to pieces. And as the sea carried the ship forward again, it struck against this tower again, and as it did so, one of the 2 knights, Andrew of Durabois was his name, what did he do but take hold of this tower with hands and feet, and get himself inside on his knees. When he was inside on his knees, they rushed upon him with axes and swords, and struck him fiercely, but because he was in armor, and by God's mercy, they did not wound him, as if God were protecting him, because he was not willing that they should hold out longer, or that this man should die. So this knight got to his feet, and as soon as he was on his feet drew his sword. When they saw him on his feet, they were so astounded and had so great fear that they fled to the next story below. And when those of the next story saw those above were fleeing, they dared not stay there any longer, but vacated this story also. Then the other knight entered after the first one, and many other people also. And when they were inside, they took good ropes and tied this ship strongly to the tower, and when they had it tied, a great many people entered. And so the struggle atop the walls commenced. You may think that the brave Andrew of Durabois was to be the hero of this story, but even such an act as his was to soon be outdone. Enter our hero, Allume the Clerk, a low-level cleric and brother to our chronicler, Robert de Cleric. With the assault teetering on the ensuing struggle atop the walls, the lord of our brothers, Perrier of Amiens, seeked for a second entry point. A walled-up postern gate was spotted, and the Lord Perrier led his retinue and men-at-arms to shore, where we pick back up with Sir Robert's narrative. So he came here, and he had with him all of 10 knights and all of 60 sergeants. Now there was a clerk there, Allume of Cleric was his name, who was so doughty in every need that he was the first in every assault where he was present. And at the taking of the Tower of Galata, this clerk did more deeds of prowess of his own body than any other one of the host, man for man, save only Lord Perrier of Bracieux. When they were come to this postern, they began to attack it heartily with their picks, and the quarrels of the crossbows were flying so thick that they were hurling so many stones down on them from the walls that it seemed as if they would be buried under them. So many were thrown, and those below had shields and targes with which they covered those who were picking at the postern. And the others hurled down on them pots full of boiling pitch and Greek fire and immense stones, so that it was a miracle of God that they were not all crushed. And my lord Perrier of Amiens and his people endured their labors and difficulties with more than a great deal. So they picked away at this postern gate, with axes and with good swords, with pieces of wood, with bars and with picks, until they made a great hole in it. And when this postern was pierced, they looked through it and saw so many people, both high and low, that it seemed as if half the world were there, and they did not dare risk entering in. When Alame the clerk saw that no one dared enter, he pushed forward and said that he would enter. Now there was a knight there, a brother of his, Robert of Cleric was his name, who withstood him, and said he should not enter. And the clerk said he would, and he got down on his hands and knees. When his brother saw this, he seized him by the foot and began to pull at him. But finally, in spite of his brother, whether he would or no, the clerk got through. When he was inside, the Greeks ran at him, more than a great many, and those on the walls began to throw enormous stones at him. When the clerk saw this, he drew his sword and ran at them and made them flee before him like cattle. And he called to those outside, to Lord Perrier and his people, "Lords, enter heartily. I see them drawing back dismayed and beginning to run away." When my Lord Perrier and his people, who were outside, heard this, then my Lord Perrier and his people entered in, and he was one of not more than 10 knights, but he had all of 60 sergeants with him, and they were all on foot within the walls. Now when they were inside, and those who were on the walls and in this quarter saw them, they had such fear that they dared not remain there, but vacated a large part of the wall and fled away, each one as best he could. Lord Perrier soon spotted the Emperor himself, and his force of 70 pilgrims routed him and his bodyguard. The sight of the Emperor in flight precipitated the flight of all the Greeks in the assaulted portion of the city, and the battle was won. Thus the deeds of one clerk, a man who would otherwise be unknown to history, toppled an empire. Our story today now comes to a close, but do not despair. I will discuss the Byzantine politics that brought such horrors upon themselves in the next video. Thank you, and farewell.